Hello,
Hello, welcome to the This Is Not Therapy Hour. I am Brandon Tessers.
I'm Olivia Candosia.
And even though you went up at the end, kind of like it's like an official intro. And this is Not Therapy Hour. This is not therapy for very, very many reasons. I am a licensed therapist, and Olivia is an intern therapist. But this is still not therapy. This is just an open conversation. Olivia and I are here talking with one another and with all of you, whomever you might be, and we're just doing our best to make our guesses about who you are and what you're interested in and what you're hearing from us and so on. For those of you who are willing and able to participate in the chat, writing messages in the chat for us to be able to read, we very much appreciate that because it gives us more information about who you are and what you're interested in, which can include, asking questions or whatever, right? Like this is an open conversation. We'll go where we go. We do what we do, and that can be Q&A, but it can also just be like any other conversation. The things that we say impact what you're thinking and feeling, and what you say next, and the things that you say impact us and what we do and think and feel. We work with a private therapy practice called Effective Artistry. Our office is in Northbrook, Illinois, birthplace of John Hughes, so very famous.
Changing it up today, Brandon.
Is it normally the same?
The intro?
Yeah.
Like
interesting.
98%.
I have no awareness or put no thought or effort into making it the same, but
That's why when I first started and there was a time you made me do the intro, I was like, not me. You invited me to do the intro, and I was like, oh my gosh, did I get the order of this right? There's usually such a flow to it, and I just
Well, interesting. Anyway, I guess I'm getting back on the script then of we do individual, couples, and family counseling with people in the state of Illinois, group counseling as well, group therapy as well. We also work with a couple executive functioning coaches who can work with people all over the world via the internet. If and when people do post comments, we tend to try to read those out because we are streaming simultaneously on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitch, and you only will see the comments that are entered on the platform that you're watching from. So if you're on Facebook and somebody on Twitch puts in a comment, you won't see it. So we try to read it out so that everybody's kind of on the same page. And then the only other thing I can think is don't worry about staying on topic. That's not really how this works. We're just talking and we'll go wherever we go. And please don't think that you need to wait for a break or, that if your question or the thing you're thinking about wanting to say isn't relevant to what we're discussing, you better hang back. Put it out there. We'll go where we go. Okay.
Yeah.
How's it going? I'm going to eat today. All we did is drink.
Great.
How's it going?
I have been thinking so much about when I was telling you about the tick in quotes I had as a kid. And then you're like, you still do that thing, Olivia, but it's not a tick. And now... What?
Yeah, no, keep going.
And now I have this awareness of this. I was already aware of it, but I didn't have the language of tick attached to it in my adult life. And now I'm reattaching it. And it's not a problem, but it is annoying me to have this different kind of awareness with a different piece of language in it. Does that make sense?
Yeah. What about being aware of it is annoying to you?
Now I guess I'm noting that it is something people see and it's not just something I'm experiencing on my own.
Oh, and you're worried whether people might judge you in some kind of a way because of it?
Maybe, yeah. Or just the frequency at which I do it seems more severe now because I am thinking about it.
Oh, you're noticing it much more.
Yeah.
It's possible you're doing it more, but more likely you're just noticing it more.
And now I'm I was stretching last night because I'm maybe this will help me not do this.
There, that's the thing I was looking for. You're trying not to do it.
Yes.
It's a bad thing to do now.
Yes. It didn't seem like at the time when we were talking about it, but now, yes.
To fill people in a little bit, and I won't give all details that are relevant to you in your life, but we were having a conversation about tics and what tic as in TIC, like an involuntary tic, and the involuntary nature of them and what's really going on and what do we mean and what are we referring to. And Olivia was mentioning a particular motion that she makes that has been seen on the stream, kind of
the shoulder or neck crack thing. Yeah.
that at one point you had thought of that as a tick, but no longer thought of that as a tick.
Yeah, I was telling you that I had a tick when I was younger, but I've grown out of it. And you're like,
Oh, that's right. You
Yeah.
said you had a tick when you were younger
yeah.
that you've grown out of, and then you described it, and it was
And
exactly
you're like,
that
that's
thing you
literally
did.
the same thing you're doing right now. Yeah.
And so it opened up this conversation about why do we call something a tick, and what do we mean by that? And as we usually do with language, it's just exploring things. It's not to like take away from or disagree with people's understandings of things. Whatever. I should say this a lot. It's been a while. I'm never trying to take anything away from anybody that's useful. What would be the point of that? Like, what a waste of my resources and anybody else's resources to be like, this concept or this framework or whatever thing, this tool that's helpful for you. I want to spend both of our resources on taking that away. Silly. But especially in a format like this, where I'm talking to theoretically, any number of people, I will talk about like the limitations of certain frameworks and certain language and whatever. And even then, it's still not about like, if you use this word in this way, or if you think it's this thing, you're wrong. That's not the case. The point is that we want things that are useful. And sometimes people have understandings or concepts or ways of going about things that are not useful to them and are actually sometimes even detrimental or painful or harmful or problematic to them. That's kind of the point of therapy, right? Everybody knows that we all have things about us that, like, whether we think or feel or do some kind of thing that like makes things go differently than we would want it to be. We want our life to be different in some way than it is. And we have some idea that there's something we are doing that contributes to that if we could be aware of and shift it in some way, it would go in a different direction. So we're just offering like other options of ways to look at things. I used to say this all the time. I don't care about accuracy, I care about utility. There are any number of accurate ways to describe anything, right? Like, this is a paperclip. It is also a small bit of metal. It's also an office supply. It's also garbage if it's in the wrong place, right? Like, we could just describe it in all these different ways, and all those are accurate, right? The fact that we can call this a paperclip and that is an accurate label for it doesn't mean that calling it a small piece of bending metal is now not accurate or less accurate. The accuracy of any way of discussing something does not detract from the accuracy of any other way. This is why we push against, especially with language, the concept of right and wrong or correct or incorrect, because it's about utility. That, like, if I'm trying to keep a bunch of papers together and I say, hey, I need to keep these papers together, do you have something? In that case, it's important that you and I both think of this as a paper clip, because if you don't, you won't think of it as an option to offer me. And if I don't, when you give it to me, I'll be like, why are you giving me that? But as most people have some experience of having unbended paper clips to use it to like poke into something, if there's some scenario where like I need something small and like strong that won't bend that I can poke into here, then it's important that you and I both think of this as just small wire or whatever, or we won't think of it as an option. So all of this language, and especially therapy language and psychology related language and philosophy related language, has so many different uses. We're not trying to figure out what's the accurate way to define these things, because there's any number of those. Mm-hmm. We're trying to find what's the most useful way for a given person in a given context to think of it. And especially when it comes to talking about things like tics, this falls under the category of things where like some people are very much benefited by certain ways of thinking about it that other people are causing problems by thinking about it that way. So we need to be able to make it so that some people can think of it this way and some people can think of it this other way. Otherwise, this group of people suffers for only being able to think about it the other way, or this group of people suffers for only being able to. Right. Put a lot of explanations and stuff out there, but just wanted to fill people in on bringing up tics. Why do you think it's a bad thing, though? All of a sudden, like before.
It's so weird because I'm still telling myself it's not a bad thing, but obviously that's not true. Like, clearly something in me is like, you should go get a massage. You should like get like somebody to like do a stretch thing with you.
So that's good. Let's not use bad thing. Let's say you now have some desire to do it less than you do it. You want to either reduce or eliminate the amount that you do it.
Why?
What is it about you doing it that you're like, it would be better if I did it less or not at all?
There is some sort of discomfort. Like there's a no, like there's a reason I do it because there's some sort of discomfort in my body that tells me I should fix this or adjust this.
Well, great. I mean, not great that that's
Yeah,
happening,
yeah,
but great. But that's important then to identify it as this thing you're doing serves a purpose.
Yeah.
And we would love it if you didn't have to do it.
Yeah.
Because the discomfort wasn't happening.
hmm
So that's great. But that's not about making you do it less. That's just about removing the discomfort or preventing the discomfort that it addresses.
yeah, that'd be nice.
But there's something beyond that. Even if we removed that
Uh-huh.
discomfort and you were still doing it anyway,
Mhm.
you'd still think, I would prefer doing this less.
Yeah, because it could be distracting. I know when I
For
see
whom?
other people, anybody.
Distracting from what? What would those other people theoretically be trying to pay attention to that pulls their focus?
I don't know. I'm thinking of someone I know who also has a very similar gesticulation. I'm not even gonna call it a tic now. And sometimes I like have trouble making eye contact with them because I am watching their shoulder movement, and then I feel bad for like paying attention to
Well,
it.
in that case, you think it would be better if you were to make eye contact with them.
Yeah.
So that's a thing that you think I should be doing
Yeah.
this, which is why you're calling it a distraction.
Yep.
Sure. It is possible that someone might be trying to make eye contact with you, thinking it's important. Let me make sure I'm making eye contact, and then you make that motion, and then they notice that for a moment.
hmm
But it takes a second, and then they would theoretically go back to eye contact or
Yeah.
whatever.
You appear to think that you know something that I'm thinking.
Oh, good language, yes. Because you're talking about how I appear to you, rather than whether I do know something.
Yeah.
We're still talking about, yeah. I have thoughts and theories,
Uh-huh.
sure, but think of it like, all right, if someone was like, I'm thinking of an animal,
Mhm.
right? Immediately when someone says that, you have an animal pop into your mind, whatever the first one is, this kind of animal. You don't think in that moment like, oh, the animal I just thought of when they said I'm thinking of an animal is the one they're thinking of,
Mhm.
even though it popped into your head. Is it possible? Sure. But you don't know. But that doesn't mean you're not thinking of one.
Right.
But then you ask questions to get information, you start narrowing things down and eliminating things. And everything that becomes clear, it eliminates things. The one you originally thought of still remains as a possibility. It's not getting eliminated. So, as time goes on, you might start to think more and more like, oh, you know what? Maybe it is the one that I just thought of first. Maybe I picked up on something there, and that's why that popped in my head. And especially if then it turned out in that case, you found out it was the one you were thinking of. I was thinking of horse. That's, oh, yeah, that's what I was thinking of. And if you do that a lot, have experiences like that relatively frequently, then you would start to maybe come to the conclusion of like, maybe there is some reason that the animal that's popping into my mind is in some way, it's still not perfect. I don't know. And I still need to check, but like, it does seem to match at like a disproportionate rate, not all the time, but like 30% of the time, which is higher than it would be if it was just a random animal,
Mhm.
So you still don't jump into like, I know what people are thinking, because most of the time you don't.
Mhm.
But you do acknowledge that like, seems like there's something I'm picking up on that influences what I think.
Mhm.
That's what it's like when I have thoughts and theories about what you might be experiencing.
Mhm.
They're like, of course, thoughts pop into my head about could be this.
Right. I guess that's inevitable, right?
Right. There's nothing you can do. If someone's like, I love this movie, a movie pops into your head.
Right.
It doesn't mean you're guessing that that's the movie they're saying.
Yeah.
And yes, as we clarify things, especially what will happen a lot in this work is I'll ask a question like, are you talking about like a farm animal? You mean like a farm animal? Or I'll say, better example, I'll say like, what kind of animal are you talking about? And they'll be like a farm animal.
Mhm.
I'll be like, so you mean like one that lives on a farm? And they'll be like, oh no, I guess not. I guess it's not really a farm animal. And then they feel like I've corrected them or they made a mistake or slipped up. So now they're starting to worry about like, oh, he's trying to guide me towards something.
Mhm.
When really I'm just trying to get more information.
Yeah.
But yeah, I have theories, and I'm always happy to share my theories, but it's the risk in sharing your theory, especially as a therapist or as a trainer, a supervisor, a therapist, is that as soon as you share your theory, people are much more likely to just think that's the correct theory.
Mm-hmm. That's why I always go, could be.
Plus, we're trying to work against, I use the phrase sometimes like put my foot on the scale, where like there are things where it's a spectrum and there's some theoretically optimal balance between the two things. And when people are too far in this direction, I'm putting my foot on the scale in this direction to bring them back here. And when they're too far in this direction, I put my foot on the scale in this direction to bring them back here. In any of those cases, like let's talk about someone who's like, I have to do my homework at 4 o'clock when I get home from school, which is generally a terrible way to go about trying to do things. So in that case, I'm trying to talk to them more about being aware of their impulses and their patterns of energy and rest and like blah, blah, blah. And people will think of like, okay, so he's basically saying like, you should be nicer to yourself and just think that that's my philosophy. But then there are times where in the other direction, people are like, well, you know, I'll do it when I feel like it. I just never feel like it or whatever. And then I'm talking about like how you need to structure things and get yourself to do stuff even when you don't feel like it. And that person might be like, oh, he's one of those strict, like, you know, make yourself do it, whether it's enjoyable or not, guys. And it's neither. It's just where is it more useful to point someone's attention in our estimation. So the problem with giving a theory, even if it turns out to be like useful in that case, it reinforces this idea that there are correct theories that can be gotten at and the kind that they tend to be.
It's just funny because it's a theory.
No. So if I say, for example, that in this case, my
jam
guess,
looks,
don't like it?
It looks cartoonish.
It's homemade. I only eat homemade jam.
Really?
I do.
Do you make it yourself?
No. My wife's family, her mother, they have a lake house in Michigan that they've been going to for like since my mother-in-law was a child. And one of the things that they do there every year is make just tons, like pick berries and make tons of jam. And so every year in the summer, we just get like 50 jars of jam to last us.
Brandon, I have to tell you, when the pandemic hit, me and my boyfriend bought a big thing of oranges from Costco, but we were like, how are we going to be able to eat all these oranges? We can't do this. So we're like, let's just make like orange marmalade and jam out of it. But then we're like, but we don't have enough oranges to make jam. So we had to go back and get more. And then we ended up doing a whole business of selling jams and marmalades and like offering special flavors for people during the pandemic and like canning them professionally, making sure like they were sealed properly. And we don't even like jam. It was just our pandemic thing. And we were in like the, you know, neighborhood pages on Facebook. And
that's funny and a great metaphor for how most people's professional lives go.
Really? How so?
Just that like you stumble into a thing. It's not that you particularly love or have some great you don't like target it way in advance. Like someday I'm going to do this thing. You just do something and then you do something and every step makes sense. And now you're in a position where like you're doing something that is valuable enough to other people that they're paying you money for it.
It's so bizarre.
And you're aware that everyone would assume that like, oh, you love this or whatever. And you're like, nah, I just
no, nightmare. Never again.
And then I got another job and like, no, I don't love my work. I don't hate it.
Yeah.
You know, I love my work, but I'm not most people when it comes to professional life. Most people don't get the opportunity to start their own businesses, unfortunately.
Yeah. Oh, also, part of that story is there was a can shortage during that time.
Oh, I remember. Yeah.
And even my friend at Uline couldn't hook me up with a can, so we were going to like every store trying to find. It was so wild. Like I don't know why we were just in
And
the.
at some point, you just stop.
Yeah. It was so much work. So much work, and then doing like personal deliveries because we didn't have anything else going on besides making the jam. So.
I remember running a business in our culture, the way that things are structured is so much more work than people think that it is. In large part because most people's exposure to people who run their own businesses is like as that person's employee. And so you're coming in later in the scenario. And then by that point, a lot of, not always, but a lot of the time, yes, that person is like, you know, has more flexibility and freedom and isn't working as much because they're hiring people to take on things. But you know, there's a lot.
Jesus are gargling. Jesus for everlasting life.
I don't think that's a serious comment, but anyway, before the jam comment, we were talking about I don't remember. Oh,
Language ticks, something.
oh yeah. You thought I had a theory, which I do, but not a theory as in I think this is what's happening, but it just isn't. This is the thought that's in my mind. It hasn't been eliminated yet. And I'm happy to share it, even though there's the downside, the risk of you then like latching onto that is, oh, that's what's going on.
I would love to hear it.
But it does seem to me like this is about, there's a couple of things you said that suggest to me that this is about how you think other people
Yes,
perceive you. when you do it.
100%. Yes,
Whether that's the specific thing of like, they think it's a tick, or they think it's weird, or
Yes.
they find it distracting or annoying,
Yes.
or whatever. And maybe people do. I mean, some people might.
Yeah.
I don't know.
and who cares? I care.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You care. Why wouldn't you care about how people perceive you?
Right,
What's irrational about caring about how people perceive you?
right,
But we talk about it that way, right? Like everyone's like, no, you shouldn't care
right.
what other people want. You shouldn't change yourself or do anything because it might be something somebody else wants or doesn't want. Like, that's absurd.
Yeah, yeah.
It just gives you a new thing to feel bad about. It's actually, in my, I don't know, opinion, I guess, it's like the foundational piece of traditional Western masculinity.
Mhm.
Is this like, you are not supposed to care about anybody else's opinions or experiences or whatever,
Mhm.
which is not real. That's not doable. You can't do that. You can pretend to do that, but the only reason that you would be pretending to do that is because you want people to think that you don't care about what other people think.
Mhm.
Otherwise, why wouldn't you just do whatever you feel like doing?
I had a big conversation with somebody about this.
And the inherent thing for all humans is that it's much more useful for every human to have some awareness of and put some attention towards how other people perceive you.
Mhm.
So if you don't do that, if you move away from that, you put effort into that, and why would you do that unless you think you're supposed to, which means other people said it would be better and you're trying to do what other people said would be better. Yes, you care about what other people think. That's not the issue. And that's the problem with, because people come to that conclusion a lot. It's one of these things that
Mhm.
like, it's impossible, but it gives you a nice answer, right?
Mhm.
Like, oh, I know what I should do. I should stop caring about
Sure.
what other people think, which you can't actually do.
Mhm.
And so everything keeps going the way that it's going. But now you just can tell yourself, well, like, it's because I still care what other people think. If I just didn't care what other people think, then it would be fine, but it won't actually change.
Right, absolutely not.
In this case, it's not about the fact that you care what other people think. It's about what is the particular way in which you are worried that doing that might cause someone to think about you. And it's not to say that whatever that worry is impossible,
Right.
because it's probably not impossible. It might even be likely, depending on what it is.
Do I know what it is?
I don't know. What do you worry people would think? Say someone saw you do that, and then in response to you seeing that, they have a thought in their head like, "Oh, Olivia, what? Fill in the blank. Olivia, really
I don't know.
interesting." Well, there's a word we use a lot, but also people
Yeah.
just generally use it a lot that people don't talk so much about what it actually means. Connotation.
Mm-hmm.
What is what something connotes?
That's probably it.
There's
Connote is a
interesting
beautiful. Why interesting that?
because that's not what the point I was.
Well, I
getting
was
at,
thinking
but
that there's probably some connotation I think people are making about me and the kind of person I am.
connotation is not a thing people make. So
Oh, I see. Okay.
connotation. The other thing is denotation. So
Mhm.
the dictionary definition of a word is the denotation.
It
Meaning,
denotes.
yeah, it has been. This is the meaning that has been prescribed to the thing. This is what the thing is. We have assigned this meaning to this word.
Okay.
Connotation is all the extra stuff that gets picked up outside of the like dictionary definition
Okay.
or attempts at the dictionary definition. So in other words, like vain, we were talking about the word vain the other day. If you look up vain in the dictionary, it will describe it, and nothing in that
Like
definition.
vanity, not vain.
Yeah, vain as in a person is being vain or they are doing something out of vanity. Nothing in that definition is going to say, and also it's a bad thing.
Right.
Like it's a morally weak thing or something that people shouldn't. That is connotation, and the most like common connotation is just that basic: this is good or this is bad,
Mm.
positive or negative, desirable or undesirable, whatever. So I'm not talking about the connotations of what I'm saying right now is when you use, because what changed is that you've now thought of the possibility that the word tick could apply to this thing that you're doing, or at the very least that other people could think of it as a tick, even if you don't. And then the fact that after that, you are now trying to do it less tells us that for you, there's a connotation to the word tick.
Yes.
That this is a thing that you shouldn't do.
Yes.
So either you for yourself or your belief about other people thinking about you or ticks generally, or both, is that if a person has an involuntary tick that they do, that's a bad thing.
Yes, and there's something wrong with them.
Yeah. What would theoretically be wrong with someone that's has a, we're gonna use this language, involuntary tick.
Yeah. Something's messed up in their brain.
Because why? Like, what's the evidence there? Our reasoning for there must be something messed up in their brain is because something is going differently than we're saying it should be. What is the thing?
The thing is that they're not moving as a typical person does not move this way.
Oh, so they're moving in a way that people don't typically move.
Yes.
So this is that like farm animal thing, right? Because now I can list a bunch of examples of like people moving in ways that people don't typically move, and no one thinks it's a bad thing.
Okay, give me them.
Like, oh man, that person is an excellent dancer.
Okay.
That person can do a backflip.
Yeah. Okay.
So it's not about moving differently than people typically move, or at least if that's an element of it, which I think it probably is, it's just one element of it. What's the difference between what you're talking about and people doing a backflip?
Training, purpose, intentionality.
Yeah, one's voluntary. One is something that a person is doing on purpose. The other is something that a person is not doing on purpose, meaning they don't have a conscious thought that's an intention of, I am now going to do this thing. It just happens. And why would it be bad if someone is doing something involuntary, meaning they're not deliberately, consciously choosing to do it, and it is unusual? Because I can give you examples of things that meet both that criteria that still isn't bad.
Why would it be bad for someone to be doing something involuntary? And what was the other?
Involuntary and different than typical. Typically do.
Because then you stand out, and that can be isolating.
Sure, but standing out can also be good.
Sure, but
And doing a backflip would make you stand out even more than a tick.
that's a little obnoxious. You're just doing a backflip, but
One could think that, sure. But obviously many people don't. I mean, like,
I
you're imagining a certain context, but like imagine Simone Biles. Generally, everyone's like, that's amazing.
my context is like backstage auditions, watching someone do the splits after their song number. Me being like, oh my god.
Just telling what context you go to. Here's the third thing that seems to serve no purpose. Because if I do something, like literally just now, I just did this motion where, that's not something that people typically do in the sense that we're always doing it. It's not even something I typically do. And it's not something that I consciously chose to do. It just happened. But we can imagine that it serves a purpose. Oh, he just finished eating and it's kind of like, wiping off the corners of the mouth or whatever, which when I say it that way sounds gross, even though when people do it, it doesn't typically get thought of as gross. But that's
unless you're eating soup. Ugh.
You apply language to something and all of a sudden it can be gross now when it wasn't gross before. Or you apply different language and it can be cool now when it was gross a moment ago. Like literally this stuff changes. I think the connotation that comes across is that it demonstrates a person's lack of ability to control themselves. That it is because it's not typical and because we don't think of it as serving any particular purpose, we therefore identify it as like you're doing something for no reason. At best, that's a waste of your resources. At worst, it's like you're doing something that actually makes things worse for you, whether it's about how people perceive you or, causing some issue for you. You bite your nails, right? And that causes problems for you with pain and hangnails and whatever. So something that we first identify as like, you would be better off if you didn't do that thing. Whether that's true or not, that's the person who's observing it when we're calling it a tick, is you would be better off if you didn't do that thing. And then the fact that you continue to do it, especially if we believe that that you'd be better off if you didn't do it. If you bite your nails and you're like, I've been trying to stop biting my nails, and then you do it again, you're like, oh, that's, weakness. You're not controlling yourself. And it's not necessarily that people would be a jerk about it and be like, oh, you suck. But if you've been saying like, I'm trying to stop biting my nails, and then you bite your nails in front of someone, they're not like, good job, you biting your nails. They're like, oh, a sign of a place where you're trying to make yourself do something differently and failing.
Mm-hmm.
We have this premise that we are in control of everything that we do, or that we at least should be, that the more a person is intellectually, consciously in control of everything their body does, the better off that person is. There's lots of stuff in our culture, like religion and philosophy and academics, all over the place, where we have baked in this concept that it's always better when you are doing something as a result of your conscious thought and decision to doing it, rather than just it happens automatically.
Uh-huh.
But the vast majority of what people do doesn't involve conscious thought.
Mm-hmm.
And for the most part, those things we identify as exceptions, right? Like, you don't consciously make your heart beat. Well, yeah, duh, you don't need to consciously make your heart beat. That's silly. But there we go, of like, it is actually possible. People do make their heartbeat faster and slower just by consciously thinking certain things.
God, it reminds me of in third grade when I was on the playground and I thought about blinking. And then for like 2 weeks, all I could think about was how many blinks I was doing.
Yeah,
It's awful. It's awful.
I mean, awful only because you're comparing it to some ideal of what would be better.
I didn't want my awareness to be there. Looking back, that was
Right,
just
but why? What's so bad about noticing yourself blink?
distracting.
Oh, so there's something you think you should be paying attention to instead.
Yes.
So some awareness, some idea of some other thing that would be better than what I am doing is the thing. Nothing bad about noticing blinking, unless you're like, oh, I should not be noticing myself blink. I should be doing this other thing.
Wait, I want to go back to the heart rate thing now. I'm thinking of a lot of memories today. Sign that I had anxiety is when I was little and I was laying in bed. I could feel my heart rate going down, and I didn't know that was normal or typical. And so I would get up and run in the hallway to increase my heart rate to make it go back up, and then I'd go back to sleep.
Interesting. I mean, that's a funny story, but what do you mean a sign that you had anxiety?
I feel like that tells me like, wow, I was an anxious child because I thought I was like gonna die if my heart rate went down or something.
Wouldn't any child having a thought that they might be about to die
I
be
guess.
anxious in response to that?
So yeah, I guess
So
so.
the thing that's unusual in that story is not how anxious you got in response to the idea that you might be dying, but the circumstance in which you thought you might be dying.
Yes.
And again, that's an opinion thing.
That's
For
so
someone from the
interesting.
outside to say like, well, that's silly. You're not dying from that. But you don't know that.
Right. Yeah.
This is a thing that commonly gets identified as like, oh, that child has anxiety.
Yeah.
Is that someone's like, can you die from this? Like my kids will ask all the time, right? Like, can you die from that? Can you die from that? Like, yeah, once you're aware of the concept of death,
Yeah.
nobody wants to die. And kind of an important part of like growing and learning is like learning how to not die.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's only when people are asking questions that we
Interesting.
think are silly or getting scared about things that we don't think are worth being scared about that we're like, oh. But we're identifying the wrong part. It's the same thing with a lot of what happens with, especially kids who are identified as autistic, but children across the board, when they, you can call it for tantrums or have emotional meltdowns or have problematic behavior, or honestly, a lot of the time I hear people just refer to it as they're having behaviors, which is like, I hate when people say that, the same way that people will say like, you're going to have a consequence to mean a negative consequence.
Right.
It just is.
It's really every single person at school when we talk about consequences thinks of it as a bad thing. And
Yeah, it's a
Blows my
linguistic
mind, yeah.
process that is like well identified. It has a lot to do with the word euphemism
Mhm.
we talk about, which euphemism, EU, Greek, that prefix means good. So euphemism is like a good way of saying something, but you're still saying the same thing. You're just using new symbols, new words or whatever to represent the same meaning. Now, sometimes that works because the problem with the way it was being said before was contained in the symbol, not in the meaning. And so switching it works, right? Like examples would be like referring to somebody's race with certain language that is
Mhm.
offensive, where that's about the symbol that you're using, because just talking about somebody's race isn't inherently problematic because people have race and there's nothing wrong with that. Other times, euphemism is trying to address a problem, but the problem is in the meaning, not in the words that are used to define it. So, like a common example that everybody knows about this, and I'm going to say the word, and like even just saying it, even in this context of saying why I'm saying it and everything, will be uncomfortable for me and for often is for others. So, the word retard is a shortening of mentally retarded, which that mentally retarded was the phrase that was initially put out as like, this is the appropriate kind thing to use to refer to somebody who struggles with intellectual disabilities, as opposed to the things that have been used to that point of like idiot or whatever. But the problem in that isn't the word, it's that we think of those people in bad ways, that they are bad for being that way. So it doesn't, whatever you end up calling that person, as long as you keep thinking that it is bad to be that way, that new word is just going to eventually become something that is associated with being bad in some way. So consequence is just, people don't want to say punishment. Like adults feel grosser as time goes on about like, I'm going to punish you, you're going to have a punishment. So instead we say you're going to have a negative consequence, but even saying negative consequence, well, that's also bad because it's negative. So now I'm just saying consequence, you're going to have a consequence, but I'm talking about the same thing. And so now consequence just has the same connotations, different denotation, same connotations as punishment did. And the thing that really bothers me about a lot of this is that we then lose access to a sign that was useful for other things. Like, what do you use now to talk about a thing which happens as a result or effect of an action? Right.
Like, the results.
But see, results has a finality to it, where consequence is just like, this is a thing. It doesn't even mean the thing you did is the only reason that happened, but it wouldn't have happened had you done something differently. Like, how do you talk about reward? If you do something, you get something good, but that's not a consequence. Right.
I can tell I've been studying for exams because I'm like, Kohlberg's moral development, stage 1.
Well, and then we want to they need to learn that there are consequences to their actions, but nobody anymore is ever meaning that as in like, people should learn that if you do certain things, that can result in really good stuff, which is really what we're trying to teach people, right? Like that if you do things, you can get really great results. But instead we focus more on if you do the wrong things, you get really bad results. And then look, we got all these anxious and fearful people. You're wrong for having been scared about that thing. The way that an autistic person, a child in particular, responds to when they're having an emotional meltdown, the way that they're responding to whatever prompted that, we can call it a trigger or whatever, overwhelm, whatever, is very similar to the way that anybody would respond to experiencing the same level of distress that the child is experiencing. The difference is not that. The difference is that they are experiencing that level of distress in response to something that outside observers are saying, and it might even be logical and rational sometimes, right, too, is to say like, that thing should not provoke that level of distress in a person. Again, people will hear this and interpret it as like, oh, so kids should just be able to like kick and punch and hit. And I've had people respond to me that way multiple times. Like, I mean, sure, Brandon, but it's at a certain point, like, it's not okay for them to do X, Y, or Z. None of this is me saying that it's okay or that I approve of. I'm just talking about the mechanics of it that put anyone in a scenario that causes that level of distress, they're going to scream and kick and punch and hit. The difference is, what is it that prompts that distress? Make any child think that they might be dying and they're going to get anxious. The difference is, what is the thing that prompted the child to worry that they might be dying? But instead we focus on the response, because it is different, right? Like we would say, most people don't respond that way when they notice their heart, but most people also don't notice their heartbeat slow down when they're falling asleep, at least theoretically. And maybe if they did, they would. But in order for that to work, you'd have to have some context, some prior experience of learning that the heart and heart rate has something to do with living and dying, but not enough information about it to understand that it slows down and that's okay. Like, it's just a very narrow window. So it can be very unusual, but anyone in that window would experience it. But we label the person based on the response, and then that they have anxiety. And then we're trying to teach people, hey, when you're worried you're about to die, you should not get so anxious about it. So that's the thing that you need to change. Agreed, I can consciously slow my heart, but only incrementally when I consciously focus on breath, my heart rate, and anxiety is influenced in a much bigger way. Slowing heart rate, reducing anxiety. Yeah, and I'll say a lot of this discussion about tics has a lot to do with how people think of the words voluntary and involuntary. Like we're talking about, it's about the relationship between my conscious thoughts and decisions and my behavior. And we generally have like a poor understanding of this. I paused there because I was going to say, I want to make it clear that everybody only knows as much as is relevant for them to know about any given thing. Like if I was tuning into some stream where people were talking about the details of like the internal combustion engine, the vast majority of what they're saying, I'm not going to be aware of that stuff because I haven't lived that life where it's meaningful and I have those experiences and have to like do that and learn and utilize that information. Unfortunately, with what we do, and this also happens with parents and educators, people have a tendency to think that because it's something that they have experienced or that they experience currently, that means they are supposed to be an expert on it, which is kind of the same as saying if you drive a car, you should know all the workings of the internal combustion engine. Just because you are a parent doesn't mean you should have all the information and know all the language and the theories and the approaches. That's not useful for a parent to know in one instance, but it's useful for someone to know who's trying to help many different people in many different contexts of parenting. But unfortunately, people think they're supposed to know it, and then they don't know it, and then they feel bad or dumb, or like we're trying to make them feel dumb. But no, it's just. But yes, this idea of voluntary and involuntary is very, very poorly understood by people. Is breathing voluntary? I mean, is breathing voluntary, right? Like, because I could say yes, I could say no. I could say yes in the sense that like I can stop myself from doing it.
Right.
I can use conscious control to make myself not breathe for some period of time, but then I lose that ability to control it and I will breathe again. Or if theoretically I was able to make myself not breathe at all indefinitely, consciously, then I would die. And we generally wouldn't say that something which is necessary for a person to live is voluntary.
Brandon, I saw a preview show of a Harry Houdini show once at the House Theater in Chicago. This is connected, but not on topic. And it was a preview show, which means that like they're still testing out stuff and like might have to go back and like fix some lights or fix something. It's just like testing out the audiences and their responses to the shows. And they were doing the tank where he has to breathe underwater, but they like called hold really loud. So they like stopped the entire show because they had it hooked incorrectly and locked incorrectly. And it was so scary. And I just, when I think about breathing, I think about that and how that could have gone horribly wrong.
That's terrifying, yeah.
But I did enjoy that for that show. They had the audience on one side, and then the stage was in the middle. So you could watch the reactions of the audience members. I did enjoy that.
That's cool.
Anyways.
It makes me think of more than one actor has died in Jesus Christ Superstar. At the end, Judas hangs himself. And so like various technical production ways of representing that, but more than once because of some like technical accident, the actor has actually died.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Have you seen the documentary, The Boy Who Lived? It's Harry Potter, Daniel Radcliffe's stunt double. And he, filming, I forget which movie, 6th or 7th, got like paralyzed from like a scene where they're pulling him with a string in the bathroom with a snake attacking him or something. But it's just a whole documentary about their friendship, and the name is very appropriate for it. But it's kind of beautiful, yeah.
Interesting. Voluntary and involuntary.
Yeah.
Here's an example of something that people will then say, well, this action is voluntary. There's something that I have never done before, and now all of a sudden, out of nowhere, for no reason that anyone can understand, I start doing it a lot. And I tell people, I say that's involuntary, meaning like I'm not choosing to do that, it's just happening.
For example?
Well, this is part of the trick I can do here, right? I can give examples of this that everybody understands and is like, well, yeah, you didn't do it before, now you learn it, then you start doing it. And I can give other examples where people, if that were to happen, I can give real examples where this has happened very famously. And then everyone's like, oh, you're faking it. You're pretending that this is involuntary, but you're choosing to do it.
Okay, give me a famous one.
Of the first kind or the second? Let's do the first kind first.
Fine.
Before I had a longer beard, I didn't do this. But now, I don't know when I started. I don't know that it started right when I grew a longer beard, but at some point, like, this is a very common involuntary thing, right? That I do. Cracking knuckles or biting nails are things that, like, a person doesn't do until they start doing it. But then after they start doing it, they could be engaged in it in a way that, like, they're doing it without voluntarily choosing to do it.
Yeah.
There's a difference between a big part of the misunderstanding here is that what we're actually talking about is impulse. We'll use the word impulse for the body's unconsidered response to stimuli, right? Like someone goes like this to you and you flinch from it. There's no consideration, no thought or deliberation involved in, like, here's what's happening, what should I do next? It just happens without thought, right? Well, overriding impulse is what we can do consciously. We can, given the right context, which includes that we have to have some time because we cannot consciously think in a split second. We can consider what our impulsive response is and be like, no, I'm going to do something different. The issue with that is that sometimes we've identified the impulse as doing something, and therefore overriding that impulse is to not do anything. And sometimes the impulse we identify as not doing something, and therefore overriding it is to do something. Meaning, like, when talking about biting my nails, we would be talking about the impulse is to bite my nails, and I need to use effort and conscious thought to override and make myself not do that thing. When talking about doing my homework, we say, oh, my impulse is to not do my homework. No, your impulse in that case is to sit where you're sitting or do whatever you're doing that isn't your homework. So the process, the mechanics of it is the same either way. Even though sometimes we think of it as, most of the time we think of it as either stopping myself from or making myself. And we treat those two things differently, when really it's the same. Because biting my nails, if it's something I don't do and then at some point I start doing it, it could be true, it's not always true. It could be true that I consciously chose to do it at one point, or that I consciously chose to do some things which then resulted in me biting my nails, even though I didn't consciously choose that part of it. But then at some point after that, it now becomes a thing that even though I'm not thinking, my unconsidered response is to do it. And if I do think, I can stop myself from doing it. And in those cases, a lot of time we then say, like, see, it's voluntary, because we're saying you can stop yourself. But that's like saying breathing is voluntary. Yes, with conscious thought, voluntary effort, I can make myself do something other than the thing which you've identified as wanting to stop. That doesn't mean that, again, after that, it won't happen again unless I continue to consciously make myself do some other thing. And everybody knows, if we frame it this way, nobody can make themselves consciously do stuff 100% of the time. Even if in any given moment you're consciously making yourself do a particular thing, there's any number of other things that are also happening in that moment of which you are not conscious, like breathing as an example. So people will look at evidence when it meets certain criteria. What you're doing is something that, for whatever reason, I think would be better for you not to do. Especially if I think that you also think it would be better for you not to do it, and yet you continue to do it. And there are times when I call your attention to it that you focus and you stop doing it, which shows me that if you try, you can refrain from doing it, is how we think of it. Then when you do it again, quite often I will then interpret that as, like, you are faking this. You're pretending it's involuntary when it's not.
You will interpret that?
People, one will.
I
And me as an example of, but, like, yes. So super famous example of this from a couple years ago we were talking about the other day is an influencer got real big on, I believe it was TikTok, but I could be wrong about that, has Tourette's, and one of her tics was to say the word beings. And then there was an uptick. All of a sudden there were a bunch of, that's just a spam someone offering to sell us viewers. Then there was an uptick over the next several months of particularly young women who started saying beans and saying it's an involuntary tick.
Mhm.
And the public response to that, you know, grown-ups, parents and educators and public media members and influential intellectuals, like, okay, this is an example of how awful social media is because teenagers are so so easily influenced by things that they think are cool, that look, these people are claiming to have involuntary tics that don't actually have involuntary tics. They're voluntarily making themselves do something and then saying it's involuntary. And if you tell them that it's obviously voluntary because you didn't start doing it till after you saw that famous person doing it, then they get real mad at you and start saying, like, how dare you accuse me of faking? This is an actual thing I'm actually experiencing. That's one of my least favorite things, is that tone of like aggrieved incredulity that people will have when it's like, when I tell someone that what they're experiencing is different than what they say it is, they get so mad at me about it, like I'm doing something wrong. It's like, well,
Yeah.
again, not that that's never the case, that people sometimes deliberately lie or misrepresent what's happening to them and then, you know, lean into anger when you accuse them of what that happens. But it also happens that people are not lying and they're telling the truth, and you tell them that they're wrong about their own experience, and of course they get angry about that too. That's not proof that you are right and they are wrong. And these are all coming from the perspective of people who are outside of the situation, looking at it and saying, I see no reason. The only reason I see why this person would start saying beans so much is because they saw it on TikTok and they think it's cool and they're trying to copy it because they want to be cool too. The same argument gets applied much more famously to transness, where people, outside observers, will look and say, like, this person never said anything about being trans until they saw it on some social media or until their friends started doing it, and now they think it's cool, and now they're just copying it because they want to be cool too. Which I understand why people end up thinking and feeling and saying those things. That doesn't mean that they are right or accurate in any way. It also doesn't mean that that never, ever, ever plays into it. And I think everyone would acknowledge that there are at least possibly times where a person is adopting something because they think it's cool. But even then, like, what exactly is the dividing line between I feel cooler when I use this language or when I do this thing, and like I feel better about myself, or this feels natural, or this feels right? Like, what about the guy who starts getting into football and all of a sudden is referencing football players all over the place? Do we ever be like, you don't even like football, you're just pretending because you saw it and you thought it was cool? Like, seeing something, liking it, finding it appealing or attractive, wanting to participate in it, be a part of it, engaged in that way, and then doing that does not mean it's inauthentic. And a separate thing from that is experiencing something and then later on being exposed to language or concepts that identify or label or name something that you've already been experiencing, and then using that language is also a thing that happens. Again, right now we're talking about transness, so people are probably thinking of it from that perspective, that a person always is experiencing whatever thing it is that they are identifying as being trans. Then at a certain point they learn the language of being trans and they're like, okay, that's what this is. That's what applies to this thing I've already. And so then you start using it, yes. Because words are learned, right? And like, people can think about that and they can have whatever issues they have, believing or disbelieving that that might be a process. But I don't think anyone would disagree with the idea that that process happens to all of us all the time. That like, I'm feeling something, I can't, it's hard to describe. And then someone's like, nauseous? Yeah, nauseous, that's what it is. I'm feeling nauseous or whatever, right? I'm feeling sick. I think you have the flu. Now I say, I have the flu. Right? The words that we use change as people offer us language.
It's like
when our experience is the same.
First year med students learning all these terms for illnesses and then thinking they have the illnesses because now they have new language.
Which is also a thing. Bader-Meinhof phenomenon, but it's connected to a different thing also. And it just occurred to me really quickly there that because I used an example of people feeling unwell.
Yeah,
that might give the impression that what I'm saying is that being trans is also a way of being unwell, which is not what I mean. Because I could use a different example of like, you know, someone's like, oh man, that movie, it's hard for me to give my thoughts about that movie, and someone else being like, I thought it was a masterpiece. Yes, masterpiece. That's right. That's the right word. That's what I was trying to think, right? Probably revealing of implicit bias and the way that I think of transness and that we generally communicate about transness, at least specifically in like a public online forum. That the fact that my first example was one that was pathological, because transness is something that is discussed even by trans rights activists as not pathological per se, but as biological and as either the result of or a part of a disorder, gender dysphoria, and things like that, which has its own stuff going on. And isn't to say that I have no bias to explore or anything, but anyway. Yeah, what you're talking about there. So we have a fun name, I guess. Bader-Meinhof phenomenon.
Is that a name?
It's two last names.
Bader-Meinhof.
These two people, I don't know their first names. I don't know if they're men or women or whatever, but
okay.
Bader-Meinhof phenomenon refers to the phenomenon of a person learns a word or learns about a concept and then starts noticing that concept all over the place. Like someone learns that a group of crows is called a murder, and then 7 days later they're like, it is crazy. A week ago I learned that a group of crows is called a murder. Since then I've seen 4 murders of crows. And what's thought to be happening there is that no, you've been capable of notice, like you've been in situations where you had access to the visual data of those things at roughly the same rate, but that without the word to guide your attention and your perception, you just don't notice it. Or if you do notice it, you notice it separately as a different thing, right? Like there are some birds or there are crows, and that you're less likely to remember. That memory is gated through language. So this is something I personally associate with my own experience of like growing older, which is just like, I notice a pain I didn't notice before. And then it's not irrational, just like when you're worried you might be dying as a kid, right? It's not irrational to be like, is something going on with me? Like, what might this be? And most of us that aren't like doctors and whatever, we might think about it. Maybe if it's bad enough or we're concerned enough, we'll schedule an appointment with a doctor or go online or something. But very commonly, I'll be like, what is this? Is this a sign of something? And then we move on and we're paying attention to something else, and we just never revisit it and come back to it. But if I'm a med student that has learned that on this side of the torso is this thing, and then I feel something, I'll be like, instead of like, oh, what's that? I'm likely to be like, ooh, that's in my liver. What's going on with my liver? Like, and then think about, here are things that happen in the liver. So again,
sounds like a nightmare.
It's used as this derogatory joke, like the med student flu or whatever it's called, or same thing with like first year psychology students diagnose themselves with every disorder or whatever. It's used as this joke. It's like, oh, those fools. And it's like, no, the whole point of the language that they're learning is that language is a useful way to identify the symptom of a thing and how it might be connected to some larger pattern of something.
Yeah.
So they should be noticing something that could be a symptom and being like, well, it could be associated with this. That's what, when they're in the doctor's case, when your patient goes to them and it's like, I got a pain here, we really want them to be like, well, that could be this. You know, most likely it's this. This is very unlikely, but it's very serious if it's happening. So we'll do a test just to check, but it's unlikely. This is unlikely and it's not a big deal, so we don't need to address it right now. Let's do it. You know, like, why is it bad that they do it to themselves?
Right. My teacher did, I want to say inform to make it sound better, but it sounded like a warning when we were in my diagnostic class. Like, you're going to think you have every single disorder in this book when you're reading it.
Tells you something about the disorders. Sorry, I wasn't trying to interrupt you. I was just making a side comment as you were going.
No, I mean, but then I was thinking, I'm like, why am I not experiencing that with every single disorder? Some of them, sure, but also a lot of these have overlap.
I have the non-self-diagnosing disorder.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, whatever.
Yes, again, like, so in linguistics, there's different thoughts and approaches to this, but there's what's called linguistic determinism, like soft linguistic determinism. I just had a side thought about like why I use this language and why I make these references, but not relevant right now. Basically, the idea has been espoused and is held by many. I'm one of them, that until you have a symbol to represent something, you cannot perceive that thing, because all we perceive is the symbol, right? Everyone knows this. No one would debate that like my perception of a tree is different than the tree. The thing that exists and my perception of it are two different things. And my perception of it is just some abstract concept that exists in my conscious space. So some argue that like you have that awareness, sensory or whatever awareness, and then when you get in, some argue that you have to have that in order to be able to then attach a sign to it. Meaning you're seeing this thing, then you get the label, that's a tree, and that's how you've now created the link between the word, the symbol tree, and the what they refer to as a referent, the thing to which the sign is referring, the tree. Others would argue, and I'm on this side of it, that until, even if it is true that you have visual perception of what we're referring to, there's a tree outside the window there that I'm pointing to.
The Christmas light's still on it.
Even if it is true that I am getting the visual data in my conscious space is perceived, the fact that until I think of it as a tree, I don't think of all that stuff as being one thing, right? There's no reason until I have some concept or understanding, because what I'm actually seeing is like what I would now call branches here and a branch there and a branch there. I can't even see the trunk from here, right? So to just assume that that's all one thing would only happen if I have a concept that there is one thing that does all of this. And in an even more detailed and like microscopically specific way, I'm using that example, but like we could, what is it that makes this a coaster and this the table, right? Without the concept of those as being separate things, how do I know that they're separate things? And we can get further into that, like, how do I know that this isn't a different thing than this? These are both part of the ottoman, but like they could be different things. This portion could be a different thing. So I'm on that side of things, that until you have a symbol, you cannot perceive the thing.
What's the opposite side of that?
Is that you're perceiving it anyway, you just end up assigning language to it. Generally, that side of things, what is discussed is that there's a mental language, which is separate from learned and spoken language.
Interesting.
Some people refer to it as mentalese. So fundamentally, they think the same thing, that there is a symbol that allows you to abstractly represent the thing, but that symbol and your acquisition of it and your ability to use that symbol and to perceive the thing is separate from learning like linguistic symbols as a language thing. And that rather than connecting the word tree, the linguistic symbol tree, to the thing which it represents, what you're actually doing is learning to connect the word tree to the mental language abstract concept of the tree, which it represents the real tree.
Right. I don't like that you used fundamentally when you use the word mentalize. It's too many.
That's interesting. I think that the root there is the same as the root in mind, but I don't actually know.
In which?
Both those, fundamental and mental. I think it's the same root. Well, I think the same root is that both. It could be that those two words are using different roots and just end up.
Yeah, I'm curious what fundamentally know.
But I don't know. Yeah, I'm interested. Anyway, yeah. So, especially like we're talking earlier about connotations, so abstract today, but I love it.
Brandon, oh my God, the other night I was Google searching difference between mind and brain because my thoughts were keeping me up. And I'm like, but what is a thought? It just was going.
What is a thought?
I don't know anymore.
Nobody does.
It was haunting me though.
See, earlier when I was saying that, like, I don't know all the workings of an internal combustion engine, I used that example because of our cultural connotations around things, where generally people are not going to look at, you don't know all the details of the internal combustion engine, are not going to look at that as a deficiency. Like, there's something wrong with you or you're falling short because that's something you should know. Because again, there are some things we identify as like, you should know that, should be able to do that. And if you can't, something's wrong with you. And then other stuff, it's like, no, even though it's possible to know that and theoretically beneficial to know that, like most people don't know that, whatever. And so it's interesting which things we identify as like what you should or should not know. Anyway, the point I was bringing this up was we pay as much attention to something as it is directly relevant to us.
Yeah.
I literally, by the very nature of what we're discussing, I cannot give you an example of a thing of which I have no awareness, but I can promise you that there are infinite number of things that I am not aware of.
Yeah.
And I mean that literally. Like in the universe, there are an infinite number of pieces of data that I have no awareness of. But even more specifically, there are billions of people alive right now that all I know about them is that there's theoretically a person. Like I don't know anything about. There are sports and books and whatever that I know nothing about. And my lack of knowledge on any of those given things has not caused me a problem.
Mm-hmm.
If and when a problem happens, that's when we identify, oh, you know what? There's some information, some awareness, some idea that would be more helpful to me.
That's why I hate trivia nights. It's awful. And like all these things that I thought were frivolous or still are to me, but these people know these things and
Well,
I never sign up.
I love trivia nights.
I bet you do.
But see, partly you're still thinking of it as most people do, that like knowing more trivia means you're smarter.
Yeah.
And knowing less trivia means you're dumber,
Yeah.
which is absurd. But it raises some really interesting questions. Why do I remember that thing when that was not directly relevant
Yeah.
to my life? Everyone has jingles that they remember. Why do I remember it? What is it about
Yeah.
that jingle that gets stuck in my? These are fascinating questions because theoretically, whatever processes guide our attention and gate things into memory, like that's all takes resources. And we have processes that are theoretically allocating those resources in optimal ways as best we are able. But sometimes it seems like we have learned something that I cannot identify any relevance for.
Yeah. And I think about, this is interesting, that like, okay, I have a friend who I can call when I have a question about X. They're that person for me. And then this person's X. And then I go, but what am I for people? Like, what can they call me about? And it's,
Well, that's the thing you can't know.
yeah, I can't.
You can ask other people what they think, and that tells you what that person thinks of you.
Uh-huh.
Or worst case, that if you think of it as that tells you what that person wants you to think
Sure.
they think of you. But again, you got to just assume a lot of the time there's no difference between that. For the most part, people would want you to think what they think of you is actually what they think of you,
Right.
unless there's some specific reason. Lying takes more resources than being honest. Being authentic takes more resources. So that's the thing that needs to be
Mhm.
proven. The burden of proof or whatever is on the fact that it's a lie. All people default to, without any other reason, default to just being as authentic and honest as possible. Only when you have specific reason do you then go, and those reasons can be wrong, right? Like I can think you're mad at me, even though you're not or whatever. But like there has to be some reason for the person to go that extra step of putting in more effort in
Right.
order to construct a lie.
I'm thinking about in 8th grade, at the 8th grade dance, a girl complimenting my dress because she liked it. And I said, thanks. And I did not like her dress. So I didn't say anything back of like, I like yours too. I just think about that often. I'm like,
Why do you think about that often? Because you think you should have said I like yours too?
because I like that lying seemed so much worse than not saying anything at all.
Right. So you're saying that not saying anything at all sounds bad. But here's another way I can describe that
Yeah.
same story. One time somebody complimented me and I said thank you.
Yeah.
And you're telling that story like you did something bad.
But it was so heightened in my head.
Well, yeah, at the time.
Yeah.
And still is what
And
I'm pointing out.
still.
Even now, you're telling this story as like, look at this time where I did this thing I shouldn't have done.
Like I made
And
up.
the story is someone complimented me and I said thanks.
Yeah.
But in another context, we would often say like, yeah, when someone gives you a compliment, you say thanks.
Yeah.
But this has been logged away in your mind as like a time I did a bad thing, but not as bad as the other bad thing. But the fact that I chose that bad, that I think this bad
Right.
thing isn't as bad as that other bad thing, says something about me, and that thing it says about me might also be bad.
Yeah.
The fact that I would rather not lie than say some polite,
Not bad, but
lie.
different. It
Oh.
makes me feel different.
Yes,
Yes.
because we pay very close attention to and think often about all the things about us that are different, not just the ones that are potentially bad.
Well, those two, sure. You look so smug right now.
Yeah, because this is one of those things. There are untold number of things about you that are different
Yeah.
from anybody else. That's not even a thing that's different from anybody else.
Right.
You're theorizing that it's different from the average, but you don't even have evidence to suggest that it is.
Right.
It might be more common for someone to just say thanks and not make the white lie, but you're thinking of it as though you're the weirdo for not saying a white lie when that could be the more common thing.
Yeah.
And there are other things about you
Yes.
that are demonstrably different.
Yeah.
Not just from most people, but from literally everyone. How often do you think about those specific things?
Right.
The number of eyelashes you have and the exact shape of your eyebrows. You know, like sometimes, but as much as that one.
Have you ever thought about how many eyelashes you have?
Not in specific detail, but I've been told that people have remarked on my eyelashes, like when I was a kid and stuff, that I have long eyelashes. So
I've never noticed your eyelashes.
yeah.
I have, but I have not been aware of it.
Well, what do you mean by notice then?
I don't know.
Yeah, notice generally is a word that we use to refer to a thing of which we have been aware. We don't generally say like
I guess I've never
if
paid attention.
if you like put a sheet of words like writing in front of me for 3 seconds
Mhm.
and then put it away. And then you were like read some sentence at random off that page, I wouldn't and I were to say like, yeah, I noticed that. You'd be like, no, you didn't. You noticed every word on this page in the 3 seconds I put it up in front of you. But I did the visual detail hit my, the light reflected off of it and came into my eyes,
Mhm.
which is what you mean by the eyelashes thing, right? Like that
Right.
you have looked at my face and logically as part of that,
Right.
my eyelashes have been apparent to you.
I'm still looking at it like I don't see it.
But yeah, generally when we say notice, we mean like have been consciously aware of or perceived.
Yeah.
Yeah, all this stuff. That's what I was trying to say is nobody's bad for not knowing the difference between brain and mind. The difference between those two things is not something that has been relevant to that person's life. It hasn't been important for them for whatever reason. Now, it is often the case, whether we're talking about this, like brain or mind, or whether we're talking about a mechanic talking about an engine, it is often the case that like, it doesn't, the fact that I can't look at the engine block and confidently say, that's the, I don't know, the first word. See, these are hard things to talk about because anything that does come to my mind is something I can identify. Because I was going to say that's the carburetor, and I generally can pretty easily identify a carburetor. Although probably not these days, like especially hybrids and stuff with a lot of whatever. The fact that I can't look at the car and say that's the carburetor, I can confidently say the fact that I can't identify the carburetor has never caused me a problem. That doesn't mean that actually, had I been able to identify a carburetor, I would have been able to solve some problem.
Mm-hmm.
If that makes sense. And taking it to mechanic, they can say that's the carburetor, and had I known that earlier, I would have been able to solve or prevent the problem.
Mm-hmm.
But until that moment, I had no awareness that my lack of awareness there was related to anything meaningful.
Right.
I have to become aware that my lack of awareness is relevant to something meaningful, and then I learn about it.
Yep.
So, yeah, a lot of what we do, especially because I don't like the connotation of the metaphor to a mechanic in the sense of you go to the mechanic when something's broken and they fix it, because that's not what we do. But the metaphor in the sense of like we have a particular niche set of knowledge and expertise about things that most people just don't need to know about, in large part because we have mechanics and therapists.
Mm-hmm.
Like, no, I don't need to know what a carburetor is. I know when my car's not working, I go to the mechanic. That's the solution I need to know.
Mm-hmm.
If all of a sudden every mechanic vanished off the face of the earth, then all of a sudden it would be a problem. I don't know how to fix an engine, but until then, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, so unfortunately, in our culture,
Mm-hmm.
we teach that a lack of knowledge is inherently problematic and either a deficiency in and of itself or the result of or sign of an underlying deficiency.
Because you get all these prizes when you're right.
That would be fine. That's not the issue. There is not necessarily an inherent connection between it would be good to have X and it is bad to not have X. That's a learned connection, right?
Okay. Say it again.
That just because I get rewarded for knowing something is not inherently the same thing as it is therefore bad not to know something. That's a connection that is learned.
Yeah.
And it is one that we teach in our culture.
Yeah.
That yes, if it's good to have something, know something, be able to do something, then that automatically means it is bad to not know it, not be able to do it, I forget whatever I said as an example. which is absurd. It's all based on, not all based on, but there's a concept we refer to as hyper-individualism that's very relevant here. The idea that the individual is solely responsible for everything that happens to that individual.
Mhm.
And we have all of us, including me, running around being like, well, I have to learn to do it on my own. Why? Like, we live in, if for some reason our environment changed in such a way that I could no longer get food from other sources that have grown it, then in that case, yes, the fact that I don't have knowledge and expertise in how to grow and create my own food would be a problem. In order for our culture and our environment to change in such a way where that's the issue, there's a crap ton of other problems going on at the same. You cannot be prepared. No one can be prepared for a scenario in which, what if I all of a sudden was cut off from all things that other humans do? And
Very apocalyptic.
yeah, and the honest answer to that question, what would I do if I was all of a sudden cut off from all other humans in all ways? The honest answer is die.
Right.
But we just don't really like that idea. We all think about a post-apocalyptic scenario. Maybe we don't all, but everybody I know at least sometimes thinks about it. I've read some things about Americans generally being kind of obsessed with post-apocalyptic scenario. Interesting theories on it, but we all have these thoughts every once in a while about like, what if, my son takes a particular medicine every day that is like, he's congenital hypothyroidism. His body does not create its own thyroid hormone.
Mhm.
It's not low thyroid, it's like none.
Mm-hmm.
His thyroid gland doesn't function. And the solution to that has been referred to as the greatest return on investment of modern medicine, because it's very easy to synthesize thyroid and just take it in a pill, and it solves everything. Like, as far as your body is concerned, there is no difference between getting it in a pill and generating it yourself.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, I have thought, like, what if in a post-apocalyptic scenario, all of a sudden we can't get it? Like,
Mm-hmm.
I've thought things about like, hey, if something's going down, I'd have to identify where's the factory that makes this, and we got to like go on an adventure to go like loot their stock and what. We all do that, but the thing about a post-apocalyptic, like, pick any post-apocalyptic story.
The Road.
Okay, and what is the sign that there was an apocalypse? What has happened to the population? Yeah, the point of anything that you could define as an apocalypse in these events is that like a small fraction of humans survive.
Right.
But because of how narrative works and consciousness works, we all think of ourselves through the lens of one of the small fraction of survivors.
Right. That's
People
funny.
think about, what would I do in a zombie thing? And nobody ever is like, well, I'd be one of the zombies.
Right.
99.8% of people are the zombies, but I would be the one that's fighting off all the zombies. I don't
Interesting.
like to deal with our own limitations. But anyway.
When I was listening to The Road on audiobook, I would just eat baked beans from a can to feel more immersed in the story.
Was this the round? Never mind, I shouldn't reference other things from your past.
This is a couple years
That's
ago.
funny.
Thank you.
That's funny.
Thanks.
Did you feel more immersed?
I did. Yeah. It's fun. I've always been into like 4-dimensional theater and immersive things. And
I've never heard that phrase before.
Yeah, I don't know if it is a phrase, but I coined it. It's what I had on my like acting website.
What do you mean by it?
I mean like you can smell like incense from the stage, and you could feel like a spray of water, or like the ground is shaking, or like sheets are passing over your heads.
That's funny, because
like Disney World almost. 4D.
Those kinds of theaters are called 4D theaters, the ones that have like fans in the chairs and the chair can move and whatever.
But I think of it as a stage, like 4D.
Interesting. So by that you mean like creating sensory experiences.
Katy Perry blasted her concerts with like cotton candy perfume smell.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Because the thing is that like, again, this sounds like I'm trying to naysay your idea.
I'm not.
The reason that in like a film setting is different is because the action taking place on the film is not actually taking place in your physical space. So if you see someone cooking, there isn't actually someone cooking nearby you, so we'd have to fake the cooking smell.
Right.
But if on stage someone is cooking, you can just cook and then you smell the smell naturally.
Life is pretend food.
Well, right, and so that's where you're identifying, like, whatever the smell is at that Katy Perry concert.
Yeah.
It has a smell.
Yeah.
And so what she's really saying is that she wants to have this different smell that isn't the actual
Sure.
inherent smell of the experience.
Sure. Yeah.
Which
Yeah.
is fine, and
Yeah.
art is that. It's not about like
Yeah.
that doesn't make it bad art. The whole point of art is that we're creating artificial experiences.
Right.
But
Yeah, I had like a Dia de los Muertos scene, and we had like the incense smell, and it was, I don't know, it felt cool.
that is cool.
Like,
That is cool. I think of those things as actually less immersive though,
interesting. Okay.
because it breaks the
Mm,
audience contract.
yeah.
It reminds you that you are experiencing something artificial.
Yeah.
Like the Disneyland example is, like
So true.
I'm so aware of the fact that my chair is going to do things.
Or the little like, I don't know if you ever had like the
like when the rodents run
yeah,
by
the
you.
little ankles.
You're like paying so much attention
Yeah,
to your
yeah,
chair
yeah.
and stuff that it takes you out of the story. That's actually my first thought about the beans thing, is that by choosing to eat the beans, you are reminding yourself that this is not a thing that's happening to you.
Totally. I guess that's true.
But that doesn't mean it's not a cool experience,
Yeah.
even though I would say a different word than immersive. That doesn't mean that it's not
Yeah,
immersive
yeah.
the way that you mean it.
Yeah.
Because I would think of it more as like I'm making a deliberate connection with the experience that the characters
Yeah.
are having. I would use the word immersive for that, but many people would.
Yeah.
These things are cool.
Yeah.
But there's a short story by, I can't remember, a science fiction author.
Mhm.
I can't remember. Shoot. Anyway, that is about this alien species that has 3 genders,
Mhm.
and they're like conceptual. They're like shapes.
Okay.
They're not like humanoid beings.
Okay.
And their art is entirely about like subliminal whatever.
Their
And
art.
Their art form.
Okay.
So the story is about members of this alien species who are artists. It's like the equivalent of theater artists.
Mhm.
But the entire thing is from the perspective of like, what do we do? What do we put in the background and stuff where people won't consciously notice it, but it will impact the sense they get of a thing.
Mhm.
That like, in the same way that, in theater might think of like, well, there's the script and there's the actors and there's the set, like on par with all of that is like, there's the subliminal messaging is an equal part of all that.
Mhm.
And of course, as with all this like really conceptual sci-fi stuff, the limitation is that we have to use our language and our ways of reckoning to try to come up with something. So it's still just some version of what we know, but
Mhm.
it points at the idea that there could be something beyond what we really understand.
Mhm.
Anyway, that's what I thought of when I was like that. Yes, it's artificial, it's deliberate,
Yeah. I'm
but
thinking
you're trying to do things that create like all art is
immersive
trying to create an experience.
makes me remember that I'm alive. It gives me an
Hmm.
awareness to my aliveness.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Because I would, again, the way I think of that word, the connotations that
Mhm.
it has for me, because neither of us is talking about the denotation.
Hmm.
For me, is a lack of awareness that I'm alive. That the story becomes like the more that the art becomes your reality, the
Mhm.
less you are a distinct individual from the art observing the art.
Mm,
The more you are immersed in the art.
that makes sense.
Is how I use it.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
not that you
yeah,
use
yeah.
it incorrectly, but
And to me, it's like, oh yes, like I am existing. I am feeling these senses, and like,
all right, today's an abstract and philosophical
It's
kind of day,
so
and now we're getting
abstract.
into like theater stuff, so let's just go for it. Anybody who's not into this is probably not still watching
honestly.
because I have a lot of thoughts about Brecht.
Okay.
Brecht,
Okay.
which, in case anybody is following and doesn't know who Brecht is, I think that's a narrow window of people that would be interested but not know about Brecht. But just in case, I think he's one of those that like if you're a theater artist with like official training, you are taught about him.
I don't know a lot about him, to be honest.
Really?
Really.
But you know Verfremdung's effect, right? Everybody learns that word. Alienation effect. No, really? Oh, okay.
No.
Some of my assumptions are being
Yeah.
proven inaccurate.
I did a lot more. Well, it doesn't matter.
Brecht, he was influential in kind of that as an outsider to like visual art, because I'm not a painter or whatever. I'm not like super into that world. So I don't know that the statement I'm about to make is true, but from as an outsider, it seems like that there seems to be this, especially like post World War II time, but somewhat before World War II, but mostly post World War II, that gets identified as like this is when the major revolution happened in architecture and visual art and
Right.
dance and so he was in that time frame, the right time to be very
Right.
influential, and it was part of that kind of like shift to postmodernism, whatever. As a side note, I love and hate both that modern and postmodern words refer to what they actually refer to, because it's so clear that the people who named those movements were around at the time they were happening.
Right.
So they named them as
it's so
like this
annoying.
new thing.
It's so annoying.
And the fact that now, like 80 years later, we're like the modern movement, and everybody, until you learn that, you're like, oh, so recent stuff. It's
Right.
like, no, this is from like the 50s.
It's infuriating when
it's
they're
what
like,
was modern then.
find a modern play monologue. I'm like, what is that? What are you actually asking?
Right, and that postmodern means after the modern, but like, again, that only makes sense when like modern just happened, and now the only thing is now that's after it. Not thinking about like, well, 100 years from now will also be after modern.
Right.
And
Postmodern. Post
which
square.
is also the thing.
Is it post now?
No, not now. But like that is a phrase that people use sometimes. Postmodern, kind of like off Broadway.
Whatever.
Anyway, Brecht. He's like a thinker about theater. Like he's known in that way and is taught in that way as like a person who has thoughts about what theater's role is and how it should be. And the thing that people learn about and remember, I think, generally most about him is this concept of the alienation effect, or the German version, the Fremdungs effect, which is just fun to say.
Now, like, that does sound familiar, but it's probably because you said it 2 seconds ago.
And the alienation effect is, Brecht was big on like, no. So he was coming in response to what's called naturalism or whatever, like Henrik Ibsen and stuff, where what was revolutionary for a while there was like, let's make a play that is so much like real life that people can just feel like they're actually watching somebody's life. And now we think of that as like, yeah, duh. But like that was revolutionary.
Sometimes I don't want that.
And so he was in response to that, he was like, no. We don't want people to forget that they're watching a play. I want people to remember this is a play, you are a person, this is a piece of art. And so the alienation effect is referring to that. He wants to make sure that people feel alienated from the art. And things like common examples of it these days that aren't even thought of as being related to that is like being able to see the light rigging on stage. Like that's something we're showing the technical side.
Right.
It makes it so that you are not as, I was going to say immersed, so that your suspension of disbelief is more difficult.
Yeah.
We're reminding you to play, because he was saying the point of theater is to make these people think. We are choosing what we put in front of them for the express purpose of saying, you should think about this. And if they forget that they're a person and they just experience it as a story, they don't think about it. And so we want to remind them, this is just a story. We want to remind them we're presenting this to you for you to think about.
Yeah.
Not to experience. And then later on in his life, he regretted a lot of that, but that stuff is still very famous.
Yeah. I'm thinking about entering a show that was set in like a perpetual winter in the town, and like as you're entering, the actors are like shoveling the snow and be like, it's cold out there, isn't it? And like it was cold out there, which made it even funnier and like enjoyable. Hang on, there's a second thought. Oh, there's another show that did something like that. I don't know where I went. It's okay. Whatever.
The funny thing is sometimes that kind of theater is referred to as immersive theater.
Oh, I know what I was gonna say.
Yeah.
I went to an immersive theater experience recently. It's called Batsu in Chicago. It's a Japanese comedy show. And my friend just like invited me last minute. And you go in and it's like an improv show, but with this famous Japanese game where like when you mess up or get the answer wrong, they injure you in some comedic way. It's
Huh.
awful. But I remember like the person greeting us at the door, and she was so like, "Hey, like so into it and excited," and I was just like, "Oh my god!" And like I wasn't buying it or feeling immersed even when I was eating my sushi, and like I don't know.
Well, again, the funny thing about what is often called immersive theater is would make you less immersed by the way I'm using the word immersion, because immersive theater generally is used to refer to like theater that makes the audience participants in the theater in some way.
Say that again. Sorry, I got distracted.
Immersive theater is generally used to refer to theater that makes the audience be participants in the theater in some way, which to me again reminds you that you're you and takes you out of being immersed in the characters' lives. Because again, like I don't want them to pick on me, you know, like I don't.
That's why I like clowning, Brandon.
Yeah. Sorry, I want to hear more about that. But, ha ha ha! Big brag about ridiculously cool Rex. That's my son. This is my father's comment. Ridiculously cool Rex. He just told me that he believes I'm Spider-Man. So off topic. That is pretty cool.
Is he Spider-Man?
I guess that my son thinks that my dad is Spider-Man. That's pretty cool. That's awesome.
That's so sweet.
What do you mean? That's what you love about clowning?
I like the well, I like that the clown typically chooses one person to interact with, and it's their goal to like make sure that person is responding to everything they're doing, and like, do you like it? Do you like it? And then everyone else is kind of just watching, and like I don't know. I think that's hilarious. Do I want to be that one audience member? No, but do I want to be one of the audience members?
See, that's funny because Olivia and I have both done clown work in our lives, which I guess I realize now probably sounds like I'm saying I have worked as a clown, which I haven't.
Yeah. I've only done
doing clown work as a phrase means like studying clowning.
Right.
But obviously
that is funny.
I've not made this connection until like this moment because we have people out there theoretically like that
clown work.
Having done clown work is going to sound to most people like I'm saying I've worked as a clown.
Right. And nor have I.
Silly. Why do we refer to that as doing clown work?
But not like acting.
We wouldn't refer to like training as an actor to be I've done acting work.
Right.
Like that would mean working as an actor.
Weird.
That is strange. Anyway, I have not worked as a clown, but I have done clown training. Mm-hmm. That sounds wrong, but that's probably the way that would be most accurate to say it. Huh. Anyway. I was not aware of this idea that like, you know, the clown would pick one person. I mean, it fits and I can imagine having seen it and stuff because to me, the point of clowning is that clowns like fail at everything that they attempt.
Yes.
And that they're like a reflection of, they're taking our like insecurities and weaknesses and limitations and making it funny to us by representing it to an absurd degree and in non-problematic ways. And so it would make sense then to pick one person because that is one of those things that humans are like, I'm always trying to impress somebody and failing. Yeah. And then, like, the more that they're trying to do that, the less impressed that person's going to be.
Yeah. And that's why it's so funny. Informal clowning is so not appreciated in the grown-up world, sadly.
Yeah. Unexpected clowning. So performance art. Well, okay. I would say that there is an implicit contract for all art audience interactions. I was going to say this specifically about performance art, but I don't actually think it's exclusive to performance art. It's just that performance art is not as easy to ignore, right? Like, in order to engage with a painting, I am accepting this explicit contract of how the painting and I are meant to interact with one another, that I'm meant to look at it and whatever, you know, not touch it and smell it, whatever. But if I don't enter into that contract, if I don't decide to interact, like I just keep walking, I just don't see it. Mm-hmm. Whereas like if someone's performing, they can
street performance,
right? They can get involved whether you're choosing to accept that contract. And I think that is so much about what people don't like about mimes or buskers, all these things, is the idea that
magicians.
Like, I have not accepted the implicit contract to be an audience member, and yet I am being, or sometimes like I did accept the implicit contract, which in most performance art is like, I'm audience, your performance, we don't acknowledge each other. And then you violate that contract by like coming and getting me out of the audience, and I don't want that kind of thing. But yeah, I think that's part of why people find clowns and mimes and whatever so How much people really find it off-putting versus how much we joke about finding it off-putting,
Right.
I don't know.
I don't know either.
And the extent to which we have joked about it so much that it then like actually causes it to happen. Like I believe that when people say they're afraid of clowns, they're afraid of clowns.
Yeah.
To what extent that fear of clowns like wouldn't have happened had there not been this kind of culture-wide joke that we all share that clowns are scary, but then over time it like becomes real. I don't know. I mean, there's some uncanny valley stuff with clowns, but I don't think they're. No one had, not no one. I shouldn't say that because that's definitely not true. But I don't think most people actually have personal experiences with clowns that are
Right.
scary.
Right.
But they've heard enough stories about it or seen jokes
Right.
about it, and then a
The
certain
2012s were a
horror
big, like,
movies.
scary time about clowns, I believe.
There is an implicit contract in the adult human world. I don't like that contract. Will I eventually be institutionalized? I suppose I would say that it is true of people who are institutionalized that in some way they have failed to follow the implicit social contract. I don't think that it is true that all people who fail to follow the implicit social contract end up institutionalized. All
Yeah.
ducks are birds, not all birds are ducks.
Mhm.
In fact, I think part of the implicit social contract is the awareness that it is absurd to expect that there is an implicit social contract that people will follow. Although we talk about it all the time, we just use words like appropriate and inappropriate, or
Mhm.
proper, improper, or nice or mean, or rude, or we're just talking about whether that person is following the contract.
I'm really trying to. This is interesting. I'm noticing that I have a lot of good, bad concepts in my head, and I'm trying to like eliminate or get rid of that because I'm thinking it's a bad thing to have that.
Funny.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can't.
Yeah.
Because again, we are finite. We're limited. We only have so much of any given resource. But right now, we're going to just talk about awareness. We can only be aware of so much. We can only pay attention to so much at any given moment. The minimum amount of resources to spend on something is 0, which means I'm just unaware of it. Right? The next step up is to be aware of something in a static context. I am aware of it. It is one thing. That's it. That's just what it is. Jai-alai is a sport. That's what I know.
Jai-alai.
Jai-alai.
I don't know what that is.
It's a sport similar to handball or racquetball, like throwing a ball at a wall, but it uses these like scoops that are almost kind of like lacrosse.
Very strange example.
Yeah, I'm trying to pick something that like A, most people don't know about, and B, my awareness of it is just that it exists and it is this thing. Like I have no opinions on the sport. I don't know the rules of it. I just know that these things about it are what they are. Wait, so my life is theater of the absurd? Well, I think all life is absurd. I think existence is absurd. So yes, I guess.
You like absurdism?
Maybe. What do you
like the like theater productions that are like absurdist plays where
you mean like UNESCO and stuff?
I couldn't even.
I don't know what are examples of.
I would.
I know it as a movement, but I don't know. Again, here, okay, this is a good example. Absurdism, I know is a thing. I don't know anything about.
Truly, I don't know much either. I'm thinking of the one absurdist play that I saw.
I think UNESCO is like Rhinoceros. I think is considered absurdist, but I don't know what the tenets of absurdist theater are.
Yeah.
I don't know what it is about that makes it absurd.
All I remember is it not making sense.
Absurd to refuse today to accept that there is a contract. No, first of all, you do accept that there is a contract given the framing of your thoughts and questions here. What you're talking about is whether it might be absurd for you not to accept the contract, but that is not optional. But this is still useful language to express something. But no, anybody who thinks they haven't accepted the social contract, you have. By default, you have. If for no other reason than because you speak language that is understandable, right? Like you are referencing concepts that we communally and collectively have agreed are worthwhile concepts to mention, and we have some measure of overlap in what we think of those meanings as. There are things about your culture or things about the social contract that you don't like, but I mean, the social contract is a metaphor, and we are beating this metaphor as a dead horse. Like we're stretching it too far because nobody actually thinks that there's an actual contract that lists everything. But in this metaphorical sense, the social contract does, as part of it, contain the idea that you are not obliged to have to follow everything, and that different people have different opinions, and there are ways to change things. None of us are doing anything fundamentally outside of that. You know, like, is it okay to call somebody after 10 p.m.? Like, some people would say no, some people would say yes, right? Like, the fact that we can all know that different people have different opinions means that we all know that there are differences in how people go about all this stuff. I guess fundamentally, the only thing I would think of as the social contract is like awareness that other people, I'm gonna level up my absurdism, that other people exist, and that interactions between humans are meaningful and impactful in some way would be the only like fundamental thing. Like, if you thought you were the only real person and everybody else wasn't real, that would, I guess, be a rejection of the social contract. I don't know. Yes, life is absurd, but that's because a phrase that I think is kind of poetic and nice, is, that people will say sometimes, is we are the universe observing itself. Meaning that, like, we exist as part of we are in the universe. If someone were to refer to the universe of the things contained in the concept of universe, we are some of that, like planets and whatever is the universe. And what we're doing is observing both ourselves and other parts of the universe. A different way of putting that is that, like, reality is, both chaos and order are human concepts, but reality is chaos and we impose order on it. Mm-hmm. We make sense of things, meaning that we arrange information and data in such a way that to us it seems to have some logical sequence or understandable content or whatever, right? But in reality, no. Like, is it a true statement that the sun always comes up every day? Like, sure, depending on a particular way of interpreting that language, but in reality, like, well, we could be extreme and say eventually someday the sun will theoretically burn out and no longer exist. Or we could talk about the fact that the sun doesn't so much come up as we spin around. But, you know, that seems absurd. We can talk about, from our perspective, it looks like the sun is coming up and it's still useful. But what about, like, on a really overcast day where you don't see it? Like,
God, working here just makes me think about how I used to take tests and overthink every single answer.
Yes, that is our job, is to professionally overthink everything. Because at the root of it, what I've been trying to say, and we'll get back to the, like, good, bad thing in a minute here. The simplest answer that works is the best answer. Including, like, if a lack of awareness works, great. Just because somebody else has more awareness than you doesn't mean that you're bad or it is bad for you not to have awareness. But our job, kind of like the mechanic, right? Like, most people, if your car is not starting and there's no gas in it, can solve that problem, right? Like, I have identified the issue here because it's a relatively simple and commonly known one. And if your battery's dead, you know, like a good number of people, or your tire needs to be changed, you know, not everybody, but as you get into more and more complex problems, that's when you're like, ooh, this requires, or not necessarily requires, because you could accidentally, you know, you could smack it and something fixes in a way you don't understand. But to, like, deliberately target and address something in a particular way requires, like, niche, esoteric knowledge that just isn't relevant, except for the rare circumstance in which it becomes relevant, which is why we have professionals, because for a mechanic, that niche information is relevant every day, all day, because they are working on hundreds or thousands, like, the number of cars that they cover, you know, the people that could bring their cars to them is in the hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, right? And same for us. The kind of stuff we're talking about is not relevant in anyone's life until and unless very specific circumstances that are relatively rare happen. They're rare in the sense that, like, the vast majority of your life, that stuff isn't happening. But they're common in the sense that in everybody's life it happens sometimes. They're, like, you know, out of the 525,600 minutes in a year, that, like,
sing it, Brandon.
500,000 of those, the stuff we're talking about is irrelevant. but everybody has at least some number of minutes and days and hours.
Oh, you didn't say it.
Saying it before.
I'm sure you have. Me too.
So that doesn't mean that people should have this awareness or whatever. It just means we only get more complex when it matters.
Mm-hmm.
And our job, yes, is to be able to go as complex as is necessary for any given individual.
Mm-hmm.
As part of why this stuff is so off-putting to people is because when someone else is struggling with something where your simple understandings that do actually work for you and most people even a lot of the time, they're not inaccurate even if they are simple. You see someone else struggling and your simple explanations and understandings don't solve the issue. You share them, they don't solve the issue. That person might even agree or understand the same simple things that you understand. For whatever reason, it doesn't work for them. Well, that's why it's helpful to then have somebody who's like, well, okay, I can go further into this complexity with you. Because when I'm dealing with something and everybody around, let's take a common example, right? That a simple solution that's offered to people when they're struggling to get things done, they're feeling overwhelmed, falling behind, just make a list, break everything down into small pieces, right? That's a simple idea. Most of the time, for everybody, any given person, most of the time, some version of that will help you. For some people, more frequently, or even they've never, not never, but very, very rarely ever experience a thing where that's not enough. Some people very commonly experience a thing where that's not enough. If I'm a person that that's helped and I've never had an experience where I did that and I still didn't accomplish whatever, then why would I know anything about what to do if and when that doesn't work? Right? So if I'm a person then for whom that isn't working and everybody around me is people for whom it has always worked, and I'm like, that's not working for me, and everybody's like, well, that's just what you do. It works. I promise you, it works. I do it all the time. You just got to do it right. And then I'm going crazy. I'm feeling terrible. What's wrong with me that I can't do it this way? I know I can't because sometimes I've done it and it's worked, sometimes now it's not working, and blah, 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 blah. Then to finally have somebody who's like, well, it's not that what those people are saying is unhelpful or inaccurate, but it is simple. And if it's not working, there's further complexity we can go into. We can look at these other elements, this other piece and that other piece. And yes, I do pride myself, I guess, on being able to go as far into the complexity as possible, which I consider to be some of the stuff that we kind of jokingly refer to as almost like questioning the nature of reality and consciousness.
Right.
There are limits to human conceptual ability to and when we hit up against those limits where we're having to say, well, this is just a concept because it has to be a concept because that's the only way we can think of it. To me, that's the furthest you can go in complexity. Mm-hmm. And yeah, the vast majority of the time, if I'm not talking to a person, if they're just hearing me talk to someone, because the idea is that when I'm talking to someone, whatever complexity I'm discussing is of interest to that person, but to other people that it's not meant for, might be watching that being like, this is absurdly overcomplicated. You're way overthinking things and making it so much bigger than it needs to be. It doesn't mean all that. And that's always generally true for that person. But then I'll talk to that would be person. Boring. Exactly. Mm-hmm. If you were to watch somebody else's therapy, you'd be like, this is so boring.
Unless you're in class learning about it.
Not even that's pretty boring.
Yeah, you know what? Fair enough. We did just listen to somebody's and 15 minutes. 15 minutes only enough.
Yeah. Look, picture whatever you imagine of the healthiest marriage. Mm-hmm. And then imagine just peeking in on those people interacting with each other in a random hour of their day. It would be boring as hell to you. There would be nothing interesting happening. Mm-hmm. Not that nothing interesting ever happens, but those things my wife and I talk about our kids and our day and what we're doing later, and that's of interest and relevance to us. But unless we're specifically selecting for stories and framing them in ways that we think will be entertaining to other people, if you're just peeking in on us talking to each other, you're gonna be like, this is boring as hell. Which, thank goodness. And it doesn't mean that there aren't times where if you were to peek in on us watching, we're having a fight and be like, ooh, that's interesting or whatever. But the vast majority of the time, no. There's a reason that reality shows make their participants sleep deprived and like
Yeah.
don't feed them enough, because unless you really, really push people, that's on top of the noisy premises, right? Like, we're putting you in this scenario, this thing, whatever. And even on top of all that, we're also interrupting your sleep every 2
That's why I love
hours
Survivor.
and whatever. Because like, otherwise watching people is boring.
Yeah.
Like, ask any
100%.
artist, especially any artist that's related to like performance art, theater and film and dance and whatever. Like, the fundamental rule of theater is, if it's on stage, it's life or death, right? Like, you don't go to a play and that play is 45 minutes of somebody sitting on the toilet on their phone looking at stuff, even though people do that all the time, because that is not of interest or relevance to an audience. So we select the things that are most interesting and notable, and by definition, those are the things which are the least common.
Mhm.
This also happens in the news in a much more problematic way.
Mhm.
That like the stories which are the least common are the ones that are most discussed,
It's like the airplane stuff going on now.
and it creates these impressions. At least in art, like, nobody's trying to say we are accurately representing reality, where in the news people are like,
Right.
we're accurately representing reality. And you can't say that's untrue in the sense that, well, depending on the particular news source, like, someone could say their news and be making shit up, but crap. But it's not inaccurate in the sense of like what they're reporting is accurate. It happened in the way they're saying it. But there's implicit bias in what things we report.
Mhm.
So to say a story accurately represents a thing that happened is one thing. To say that we are giving an accurate depiction of the world is a different thing, and that is demonstrably untrue. Because the stuff that happens the most frequently isn't on the news, because that's not newsworthy. But everybody ends up with, and yeah, this plays into our work a lot, everybody ends up with this idea of like, everybody else, X, Y, or Z, not me or any of the people I know, at least not any of the people I know well enough that like they would actually tell me the truth about this and not be incentivized to try and give me the right answer or whatever. But, from what I understand, everybody else besides me and everybody I know is like this. We get these impressions of how the world is. Like, I'm on the North Shore of Chicago. You live in Chicago? Yeah, right? And people who are not from Chicago and don't live in Chicago these days, especially given which news sources they pay attention to, they hear you live in Chicago and they're like, oh my God, be safe out there.
Oh my God.
Like, you could get shot at any moment, because that's the representation they're getting of what this city is like. When it's like any other city where like the vast majority of people that live in this city are safe all the time. Like, that doesn't mean that nobody gets killed or robbed or whatever, but there's X million people in the city, and it's
pretty
like,
big.
however many 100 or 1,000 people experience those things. And like any other city, there are areas where that happens more frequently and areas where that almost never happens. But simple understandings. You don't live in Chicago, it's not really that important or relevant to have an understanding of the specific breakdown of, like, before I moved to Chicago, I thought of Chicago as a very diverse city, because it is. I mean, population-wise, it's like 40% white, 40% black, and compared to where I had lived previously, that's like, wow. Of course, then you get to Chicago and realize, well, the 40% that's white is the north side,
Right.
and the 40% that, like, the city as a whole is split up in that way, but
Right.
each individual neighborhood is still pretty much all white or all black with minor variations. So, talking about good, bad.
Oh, yeah.
No awareness is the minimum. Next is, it's a thing. That's the least I can be aware of something, is that it exists. This is what it is. It is a static thing. It is unchanging. I don't know about like the different ways it can be. It's just a thing. Well, what's the next beyond that most complex way is duality. Two options. It's this or it's that. It's day or it's night. It's alive or it's dead. It's good or it's bad. So there are a lot of things where, having no awareness of it, at some point we became aware that like, no, it's better if I'm aware of it. And then became aware that like, oh, you know what, there's different ways this happens, or different ways to go about this thing. It's not just one thing. And the simplest version of that is like there's a good version and a bad version, good way and a bad way. And even as we become aware of like, no, there's 500 different versions, a lot of the time that still comes down to good and bad, right? Like there's however many different movies, but you could still break each one of those down if you needed to somebody. It's like, this one is good, I liked it. This one is bad, I don't like it. So that good and bad is, in a sense, really like, I want to say literally, but maybe it's not literal. The concepts of good and bad, I was going to say literally again, it is just a way of representing that there are multiple versions of a thing, multiple things that something could go, and that some of those are preferable and some of those you prefer to avoid. And we just have to name that concept and we call it good and bad.
Sure.
That's all it represents. It's like,
yeah,
you know, it's good to be healthy, it's bad to be unhealthy. But healthy and unhealthy themselves are already just saying like there's some that are preferable.
Right.
So yeah, you can't stop that. That's like saying I want to be aware of everything. Like, sure, of course you do.
I don't know about that.
Like, so to get rid of this idea of good or bad means I need to be aware of everything that I currently think of as, you know, can break down more or less to good or bad in a more complex way. And you can't do, you have to pick your things.
Right.
And so there are things where people are like, well, that's good and that's bad. And you're like, well, actually, I know more about this and it's not so much good or bad, you know. And we do that. Like,
was that you as you?
Not really, but yeah, it does. That is the thing I do. If I try and turn on my car and it makes some weird noise, I'll be like, that's bad. Because like, it doesn't usually do that, right? Like that's concerning. I might not literally think this is bad and a sign of something bad, but the way my attention goes to it is that's worth noting because it might be relevant to some kind of problem or whatever. And it might not, it goes away and then I don't worry about it. But I still, in that first moment, I'm like, better pay attention to this because this could be bad. Whereas to somebody who knows more about cars could start the car and hear that same thing and be like, no, that's just the belt, you know, because it's cold outside and this is an older car, certain parts rusting. And so when it starts up, you know, it's just breaking off that ice. And they're not saying that's good. So it's good? No, it's not good. So it's bad? Well, no, it's not bad either. It's just what's happening. It could be associated with or indicate that something bad might happen later, but not necessarily. You know, like if you can say what a thing is, then you don't have to think of it as good or bad.
Yeah.
It's only when you don't know enough to know about what the thing is and how it's related to other things that we have to simplify it. It's like, look, I just need the bottom line here, good or bad.
Right.
Is this something I need to worry about or not worry about? That's all. Make anybody all of a sudden aware of their heart. Honestly, right now, if I could snap my fingers and like every single person in the United States becomes very aware of their heart rate, their heartbeat doesn't change at all. They just become very aware of it all of a sudden. If I snap my fingers and that happens to 300 million people, like 70 million of those people would think they're dying because their awareness shifted of it. So your story about you being anxious, you know, like if anybody all of a sudden is like, I can feel my heartbeat, to be like, that's bad. Well, it's the landlord. We're looking at potentially picking up more office space. We're growing. You know, come on down to Effective Registry.
Come on down.
If this kind of conversation sounds interesting to you and you are a therapist, please reach out to us. We're going to be doing some hiring.
Wow.
This is exciting.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. Anyway.
Oh, I was going to mention there is an episode of Game Changer on Dropout. Every episode, the game changes. You don't know what the rules are until you start playing the game and you find out. And there's one called Cool as a Cucumber. And they put on these like heart rate monitors, but lied to the players saying it was something else. And the idea was they had to keep their beats per minute. Like if they went 20 beats per minute, 20 over, they did not get a point. But if they kept it at that or lower, they would get a point for each round. And it was just very interesting how they were like trying to control their heart rate the entire episode.
See that?
I know, that's why
we gotta wrap up because
I know.
But I'll just say this quickly as a note for you more than anybody. Later conversation if you're interested.
Okay.
So many of these things, and that would be like controlling your heart rate as an example of this, that a conscious attempt to do it actually makes it worse. The
Uh-huh.
more you try to be like, I gotta calm down, the less calm you are. Conversely, though, if over time you make conscious effort to do things, then you can make it so that at a later point in time, when you consciously try to do that thing, it works. Meaning, like, with no prior preparation, if just dropped into it, you're like, I got to calm myself down. The thought, I got to calm myself down, is the thought that makes you less calm.
Mm-hmm.
So it
Yes.
gets worse
Yes.
the more you try. But if you prepare and learn a couple things and practice a couple things and shift your mind and your body and get it used to certain things, then it can be true that later after that, you can be like, I got to calm myself down. And then you can do something that does actually calm yourself down. So there are things where, like, people give up too soon because trying to do it right now, they're like, I should be able to just make myself do this thing right now, and it gets worse. And so then I'm like, I can't do this thing. Instead of, you got to do certain things over time to get to. There are documented cases of people, like particularly certain Buddhist monks and whatever, that, like, you can attach thermometers to parts of their body, and then they can just consciously lower their body temperature by 10 degrees. Like, the things that we theoretically could get our bodies to do with the specific training over time to do it. But none of us, if we were trying to do that right now, is it going to happen? So there's.
I'm angry we have to end this.
I know. Good to be with you all.
Thanks.
See you next week.
Bye.